Oh, hello, hello. Yes, Dr. Jimmy here once again to tell you about more exciting Halloween Horror Nights history. Oh, joy. Yes, at last we can start in talking about the events of 2006, Sweet 16. But first, those of you who have watched my videos in the past and hopefully enjoyed them, and those of you who are rather observant might notice something a little bit different this time. You might be saying, wait a minute, wait a minute. Um, that Dr. Jimmy's part is not on the same side. His ring is actually on his left hand. What's going on here? This is no longer a mirror image. It is no longer a reflection of fear. It is an actual how I really look image. Isn't that amazing? How did that happen? New technology. Yes, I've got some new technology and a new way of recording my Horror Nights histories, and I'm trying it out with this one. We'll see how well it works, okay? Alrighty. Looks like there's a slight time lag though on my voice. I hope it doesn't do that when I post this up. Otherwise I'll look like I'm in a foreign movie. You should have done that. You cannot. No match for my Tiger Kung Fu, your crane style, or something like that, right? Anyway, never mind. Before I proceed with the delights of Halloween Horror Night 16, there's a couple of things I want to touch on first. The first is a little bit of Halloween Horror Nights history, a little lost nugget of Halloween Horror Nights history that I neglected to mention when I did my previous entry on Halloween Horror Nights 13 way back in November. And let me just go ahead with that right now. As you may recall, I mentioned how when they were preparing the event of Halloween Horror Nights 13, that Arts and Design did not come up with Paolo Ravinsky, the director. The idea was actually for marketing. And what I failed to mention was that prior to that, when they were preparing that event, the second year at An's Adventure, they actually did have an icon that they were planning to use, you see, to follow up the caretaker who had been the year before. They actually had an idea and a concept for an icon, one of those mysterious icons that never were. And I failed to tell you about him. So I'm going to do so now for the benefit of those of you who don't know the story. Well, as it turns out, the idea was the caretaker, Albert Kane, was only a minion of a greater, more powerful evil above him. Yes, a sinister lord of all darkness and evil, known only as the Master. Not, and I must emphasize this, not the evil Time Lord from Doctor Who. No, different Master, okay? This Master was sort of based on a very interesting piece of artwork. If you were a teenager in the 1970s, odds are you had a poster on your wall of Frank Frazzetto's artwork. If you don't know who Frank Frazetta, it means you're young. He was an artist who did a lot of heavy metal album covers. He also did a lot of paperback book covers, especially Conan the Barbarian, and he specialized in exaggerated physiques, both male and female, that defy gravity, and they were usually big muscular barbarians in tiny little loincloths and buxom wenches in very little clothing. Sort of, I think, we remember Princess Leia's outfit when she was Jabba the Hutt's slave girl. Less clothing than that, okay? Now you know what I'm talking about. So, stuff like that, fantasy artwork. And I must confess, I myself had a copy of that particular artwork that inspired the Master to some degree on my wall when I was a young man, but not a poster. No, this was an actual painting. No, not an original Frazetta. I'm not that rich. No, this was, and I almost am embarrassed to admit this bit of kitsch, but yeah, it was a copy of his work painted on black velvet. Don't ask. Anyway, I had that years ago. When I thought, because when you're in your 20s, you think shit like that's cool. But the painting in particular shows this huge, enormous, muscular, powerful barbarian warlord who reminded you a little bit of the Dark Riders from Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, except shirtless. But he had the black hood and the glowing red eyes. But he was up on top of this enormous freaking black stallion, way also out of proportion, with glowing eyes. And man on horse was holding a big staff which had sort of an axe, battle axe, scythe combo, sharp, pointy, deadly thing. And he was there with that, glaring out at you. And the name of the painting is Death Dealer. Famous Frazetta painting, the Death Dealer. And so, partially inspired by this image, they came up with an idea of this evil overlord of icons who would oversee the lesser icons like the Caretaker and possibly Jack as well, I don't know. And he would be the master of all evil, and he would be on this gigantic freaking horse. Yeah, they actually thought they'd bring a guy on a horse, a real live horse, in on Islands of Adventure, galloping about, "I am the master, bow down to me, human scum," or whatever the hell he was going to say. So this was their idea. Now, as you can well imagine, the logistical difficulties of having a big freaking horse in Islands of Adventure had a lot to do with why this never happened. Some parks horses can tromp through, like the Magic Kingdom, for example, has their horse-drawn trolley. There's a reason they close that at dusk, because in the dark when it's harder to see, it's a lot easier to step into horse poo, okay? And they usually have in a parade or whenever they have a horse on the street, there's usually about 2 or 3 of these little, what do they call them? They don't call them sanitation workers. They call them custodial hosts. Yes, at Disney. Custodial hosts. God, you gotta love the Mickey euphemisms. Custodial hosts and hostesses who will come rushing out to scoop up any horse droppings anywhere along the way. Because God help you if you are wearing flip-flops out in a theme park and you step into the horse poo and it gets all up between your toes. Yeah. And you're saying, well, gee, Dr. Jimmy, you said that almost like you had personal experience. And yeah, I have to admit, not from a theme park. But you see, when I was a little boy living in Hawaii, way back in the early 70s, I lived out in sort of a country part of the island of Oahu where there was lots of big fields filled with what we call California grass, which are tall weeds. And if you're a 7-year-old boy, that's an awesome thing to play, soldier, combat, war, whatever you're going to do out there with the other kids playing, kill each other games, running around with your toy guns, having a wild time as a little kid. Now, thing is, some of our neighbors owned horses, rural area, right? And so there were horses in some of those fields. And so your little kid running through those fields and your little kid, 7-year-old, living in Hawaii, are you going to wear shoes a lot? No. Sometimes entire months, especially in the summer, would go by where shoes never went on my feet. So I'm running through those fields and yeah, between the toes. And when that happens, your mother doesn't let you go back in the house right away. No, you gotta fuck around with a garden hose for a while trying to get everything out from between your toenails. Ugh. And you want to go back in the house to get a bite to eat, but she won't let you. Get it clean first. I don't want any of that in my house. All right, so that's enough stories about horse poo. Didn't expect a whole big lecture on horse shit in this, did ya? No. Okay, now, so that's a reason why the master didn't happen. And of course, then marketing presented A&D with the director, and history was made. A little bit of history I failed to mention back in November when I did that. So now you know. And knowing is half the battle. Okay. Alright, pork chop sandwiches. Never mind. running off onto wild tangents. Okay. Now, one more little thing before I leap into Halloween Horror Nights Sweet 16. A disclaimer. A disclaimer. I must confess to you all, must confess, that unlike most of the recent years of Halloween Horror Nights, my experience of Halloween Horror Nights 16 was sharply limited. You see. Now, as I had said in earlier videos, if you watched all of them, and if you didn't, go back and watch them now, and then come back and watch this after you completed them all in sequential order, okay? If you watch the earlier videos, you will know that I've said a couple of times that from the 1991 through 1998, the first 8 years of Halloween Horror Nights, I only managed to go to the event one night during the event. But then ever since 1999, I usually got to go several nights. In fact, as we went on through the 90s into the 21st century, I got to go more and more and more as I had more free time available to me and got older and had a little more money to spend and everything else. You got to go more often and do more stuff, right? But due to a lot of personal reasons, which I can't go into because they're personal, duh! For those reasons, I was not really able to get to Halloween Horror Nights as often as I would have liked in 2006. In fact, I only was able to attend the event one night. I am fairly certain that one night was September 29th of 2006, the opening night of the event. I had planned to go back the following night and maybe a couple more times, but it didn't turn out that way. So I only went the one night. Now, I did manage to go into all the haunted houses. I did manage to go through all the scare zones. I saw 3 of the major shows. There were a couple of things I missed. Not very much, and I'll mention that when I get there. So I don't have all the first-hand experience I usually have when I give it. I have limited experience. I still was there. I have first-hand experience, but there are some houses I only went through once, okay? There are some scares I missed altogether due to bad timing going through some of the houses. And I had to rely a little bit for Halloween Horror Nights 16 on account some other people to get it right. Okay, so that's a disclaimer because I'm honest. And I'm not going to pretend I went there every night throughout the entire run, and I know everything that happened in every single room at all times throughout Halloween Horror Nights 2006. And what color underwear Jack was wearing when he... never mind. And what bra size the storyteller... No. Alright. That being said, we will now proceed, as we have a couple minutes left, with Halloween Horror Nights 16, Sweet 16. Now, this was the first time in the history of Halloween Horror Nights that the entire event was themed as a retrospective of the previous year's events. After 15 years of Halloween Horror Nights, for some arbitrary reason, the 16th year was chosen to be a retrospective greatest hits sort of year. Now, they did have a greatest hits house once or twice in the past, like the one in 2004, which had, it was called Horror Night Nightmares, which featured previous icons from previous years. But this time the entire event was like that house, made large. So you have bringing back all sorts of ideas, characters, and favorites from previous years. Why they did this in 16 instead of 15? Why they didn't wait till 20? I don't really know. It's one of those mysteries. Why was 16 picked? It seems like an odd choice. Although the idea of a Sweet 16 party, usually for a young lady who turns 16, which is a tradition, has partly to do with it. And also, I think, because this was the year that Halloween Horror Nights came home. And that was something they kept saying. Horror comes home. Home being Universal Studios Florida. Of course, from 2002 through 2005, the event was held at Islands of Adventure. The only exception being 2004, it was still held and centralize Islands Adventure. At least you entered the park that way. But there were portions of Universal Studios Florida you could visit during the course of the evening, and it covered 2 parks. But for the most part, this was the first time the event was moved back completely to Universal Studios Florida. This is the end of part 1.